Before the first cannon roared over Fort Sumter, before the fields of Gettysburg were stained with blood, the United States was already a nation at war with itself. It was not a conflict of armies, but of souls. In the mid-19th century, under a veil of prosperity and expansion, two worlds, two irreconcilable visions of the future, coexisted in a precarious balance. In the north, an industrial society forged in the fires of factories and driven by free labor. In the south, an agrarian aristocracy whose opulence and way of life depended on a brutal institution, slavery. This is the story of the twilight of that union, the tale of how the promise of freedom became a prophecy of war. To understand the fracture that was to come, we must travel back to the decade of the 1850s, the echo of the American Revolution with its bold declaration that all men are created equal resonated increasingly hollow. As the North expanded westward, building railroads and attracting millions of immigrants with the promise of a new life, the South clung to its peculiar institution. The economy of cotton was the engine of the country, and that engine ran on the sweat and suffering of 4 million human beings treated as property. This moral abyss was not merely a political difference, it was an open wound in the heart of the nation. In the halls of Congress, legendary leaders like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, the great compromisers, desperately tried to keep the nation united. Their compromises, such as that of 1850, were feats of diplomacy, temporary patches over a crack that widened day by day. But one cannot negotiate with the unnegotiable. Each new territory acquired in the West became a political battleground. Would it be a free state or a slave state? The question was not trivial. It was a struggle for control of the future of the United States. As politicians debated, the voices at the extremes grew louder. In the North, abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison demanded not compromise but total and immediate eradication of slavery, which they called a pact with death. Their moral fervor ignited the conscience of the North. In the South, ideologues like John C. Calhoun defended slavery not as a necessary evil, but as a positive good, an ordered system that, according to them, was superior to the chaotic industrial society of the North. Both sides saw themselves not as adversaries, but as mortal enemies in a war for the soul of America. The tension finally erupted into violence. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which proposed that settlers in the new territories decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, turned the prairies into a dress rehearsal for civil war. Supporters from both sides flooded the territory, and bleeding Kansas became synonymous with ambushes, massacres, and a hatred that could no longer be contained by politics. The bloodshed on the frontier was a harbinger of the carnage to come. The nation had grown deaf to dialogue. Each event fanned the flames: the brutality of the Fugitive Slave Act, the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin that horrified the North, and the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case that denied any rights to African Americans. The Union was no longer a shared ideal, but a cage in which two wounded beasts eyed each other with distrust. The point of no return came with the presidential election of 1860. The victory of a lawyer from Illinois, a man from the new Republican Party who firmly opposed the expansion of slavery, was perceived in the South not as an electoral defeat, but as a declaration of war. His name was Abraham Lincoln. For the South, his election was the ultimate proof that they had lost control of the nation and that their way of life was doomed. Thus, in the twilight of the Union, the question looming over the United States was terrifying. Could a house divided against itself stand? Was it possible to reconcile freedom with slavery? History was about to deliver its brutal verdict. In the next chapter, we will witness how the election of Abraham Lincoln becomes the spark that ignites the powder keg, leading to secession and the beginning of the bloodiest war in the history of the nation. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. The pre-existing tension intensified, and the manifestations of discord resonated strongly throughout the nation. In 1860, the United States found itself at a crossroads, caught between the hope for unity and the winds of secession blowing from the South. The presidential election of that year would become the catalyst that unleashed chaos and disunion, a theme woven into the hearts of citizens from both regions. The political and social atmosphere leading up to the election was marked by extreme polarization. The debate over slavery had reached its peak. In the North, a growing abolitionist movement clamored for the freedom of slaves, while in the South, the agricultural economy, sustained by slave labor, clung to its way of life. Tensions escalated following the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case, which declared that slaves were not citizens and that Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories. This ruling not only irritated those in the North, but also solidified the determination of the South. In this climate of instability, the figure of Abraham Lincoln emerged as a symbol of hope for many, but also as an object of fear for others. Lincoln, a lawyer from Illinois, had been chosen as the candidate of the Republican Party, a new party that opposed the expansion of slavery. His election represented not only a shift in politics, but a direct challenge to the authority of the South. Lincoln's decision to run was an act of courage at a time when the country was teetering. The other candidates in the 1860 contest were a mix of political figures. Stephen A. Douglas, the most influential Democratic candidate, advocated for the principle of self-determination. In the South, the Democratic Party was divided, presenting John C. Breckinridge, who defended the expansion of slavery. The fragmentation of the Democratic vote became a crucial factor that facilitated Lincoln's victory. On Election Day, the 6th of November in 1860, the nation was engulfed in anxiety. The results were decisive. Lincoln had won the presidency without receiving a single vote in 10 southern states. This fact, which should have been cause for celebration in the North, provoked a torrent of reactions in the South, where the victory of a Republican was interpreted as an existential threat. The response was immediate. Less than 2 months later, South Carolina became the first state to declare its secession. Its resolution, adopted on the 20th of December in 1860, was a manifestation that evoked both desperation and determination from a South that felt its way of life was in danger. This decision set a precedent that would lead other states to follow suit. Within weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas also joined, forming a bloc of resistance that would call itself the Confederate States of America. The immediate consequences of Lincoln's election were profound. The nation was now divided, not only territorially but also ideologically. The question that hung in the air was unavoidable. Could the United States survive this fracture? The voices advocating for reconciliation were drowned out. The manifestations of a possible battle were already resonating, but the true conflict was just beginning. However, amid this growing tension, one question loomed over the future. Would war be the only way to resolve the differences, or was there still some hope for salvation? As secession unfolded, history awaited in unsettling suspense. With each of these movements, the political landscape was being reconfigured. The sequence of events that would follow South Carolina's secession would mark an irrevocable turning point. The next stage would lead us to the formation of the Confederacy, an act that would further cement the rupture and give rise to a conflict that would change the course of history. The election of Lincoln found its most tangible and heartbreaking form in South Carolina. In the winter of 1860, the political climate of the United States was becoming stormy. Lincoln's victory had sown discontent in the South, where secession was already looming on the horizon. South Carolina, a stronghold of cotton culture and economy, was at the epicenter of this storm. The historical context preceding secession was marked by deep discontent among the southern states and the growing influence of the North. The agricultural economy, sustained by slave labor, clashed with the emerging values of industrialization and abolition. Tensions were exacerbated by laws and political decisions that favored the Union, while Southerners felt marginalized and vulnerable. In this environment, key personalities began to emerge. Among them was John C. Calhoun, a veteran politician who became a fervent advocate for states' rights. Calhoun viewed Lincoln's arrival as an existential threat and began to advocate for secession. His rhetoric resonated with many in South Carolina, where the fear of losing power fueled secessionist fervor. On the 20th of December in 1860, South Carolina became the first state to declare its secession. The Secession Convention, convened in Charleston, approved the resolution by an overwhelming margin. It was an electrifying moment, an act that would resonate and lay the groundwork for events that would change the course of the country. The delegates signed the declaration and, with it, opened the floodgates to a tide of secessions. It is pertinent to analyze what led South Carolina to make such a decision, whether it was a struggle for rights or a defense of a system that many considered outdated. As news spread, the immediate impact in South Carolina was palpable. The atmosphere was filled with a sense of triumph for some and fear for others. Celebrations erupted in Charleston, where citizens rejoiced. However, beneath the surface, uncertainty loomed over the future. Secession not only meant a break, but also raised questions about the viability of a separate state. It is pertinent to analyze whether South Carolina could survive without federal support and what would happen to economic ties. The secession of South Carolina was not an isolated act. It was the catalyst for a series of events that would lead other states to follow the same path. In the following weeks, the repercussions of South Carolina's decision resonated in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, each considering its fate. Thus, secession became a chain phenomenon, a question that challenged the notion of unity and national identity. The analysis of South Carolina's secession reflects a deeper dilemma: how far the southern states were willing to go to protect their way of life. The decision to break with the Union was only the first step on a path filled with complexities and conflicts. The repercussions of this act would extend far beyond, marking the beginning of a war that would transform the nation. As the consequences of secession reverberated in the South, the next chapter was brewing in the offices of Confederate leaders. The formation of the Confederacy, with the election of Jefferson Davis as its president, was just around the corner. It is pertinent to analyze what new secrets and conflicts would arise from this union of states in search of their own identity. The answer would only be revealed in the days and months to come. The secession of South Carolina evolved into a dramatic and definitive response. As the calls for separation resonated in the South, a group of states united in an effort to forge their own destiny. Thus was born the Confederacy, an entity in the history of the United States that not only challenged the authority of the Union, but also laid the groundwork for a conflict that would change the face of the nation. The decade of the 1860s was a mosaic of tensions. The issue of slavery loomed over the future of the country. In the North, industrialization was gaining ground, while in the South, the economy depended on slave labor. This chasm between two worlds was not merely an economic issue. It was a reflection of irreconcilable regional identities. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, an opponent of the expansion of slavery, was the spark that ignited the powder keg. South Carolina's decision to secede was the first act of a drama. This act was not a mere whim. It was the result of a context in which many Southern leaders believed their way of life was threatened. The call for secession resonated, and soon several states would follow suit, creating a phenomenon that surprised everyone: the formation of the Confederate States of America. The creation of the Confederacy was a political and emotional process. In February of 1861, representatives from 6 states gathered in Montgomery, Alabama, to formalize their union. This meeting would not only mark the birth of a new country, but also reveal the aspirations of a population that felt endangered. With each decision, a new destiny was woven, manifested in the election of Jefferson Davis as provisional president. It is pertinent to analyze who this man was that would assume such responsibility. Jefferson Davis, a former senator from Mississippi, had forged a reputation as an experienced politician. However, his leadership was also marred by the lack of unity among the Confederate states, a key element in the development of the conflict. It is relevant to analyze whether he would be able to maintain cohesion in a set of states divided by regional interests. The Confederacy quickly established itself in an environment of uncertainty as the new leaders organized. The question of international recognition became one of the main concerns. The Confederacy aspired to be seen as a sovereign state, but European powers, primarily Great Britain and France, adopted a cautious stance. The situation turned into a diplomatic labyrinth. Events accelerated in a climate of growing hostility. As Confederate leaders worked to consolidate their government, tensions with the Union increased. The lack of solid infrastructure and the diversity of interests revealed their weaknesses. Davis's decisions would face the reality of an imminent conflict. It is pertinent to analyze whether the Confederacy could sustain itself and endure. The development of events was swift. From the creation of a central government to the formation of an army, the Confederacy faced the challenge of articulating its identity. Key decisions, such as the selection of generals, were made in an atmosphere of concern. The question was whether the Confederacy could survive the impending confrontation. The immediate consequences were profound. It was not merely a struggle for autonomy. It was an ideological confrontation. The South, with its economy dependent on agriculture and slavery, faced an industrialized North. The polarization of public opinion intensified. Thus, each state positioned itself not only on the battlefield but also in the realm of opinion. However, the Confederacy was not a monolithic bloc. Internal tensions threatened its stability. It is relevant to analyze whether Confederate leaders could overcome their differences and present a united front. This dilemma would be a constant throughout the war. The analysis of the chapter hovers over a question. It is debated whether the formation of the Confederate States was an act of courage or a desperate attempt to preserve a system destined to be dismantled. History leaves us at a turning point. As the Confederacy began to take shape, the world watched. War was around the corner, and the next chapter would unfold at Fort Sumter, where the first shot would mark the beginning of a conflict that would transform the nation. It is pertinent to analyze whether the Confederates were ready. The formation of the Confederation brought the nation to the brink of war. In a climate of growing tension, the conflict between the North and the South became increasingly palpable, a manifestation of the division in every corner of society. The recent secession of South Carolina had ignited the fuse of a conflict that many feared. The Confederation's decision to attack Fort Sumter would become the first shot in a war that would transform history. The historical context in which the bombardment of Fort Sumter took place on the 12th of April in the year 1861 is crucial. As tensions rose, the political atmosphere in Washington became strained. Abraham Lincoln, newly elected president, found himself in a precarious position. His attempt to preserve the Union was undermined by the resistance of the southern states, which had not only separated but were also determined to assert their independence. The fort, located in the harbor of Charleston, was a symbol of federal authority in a region that had declared its secession. It is pertinent to analyze what this fort truly represented in the context of a divided nation. The key figures in this drama are both military leaders and politicians. General P.G.T. Beauregard, commander of the Confederate forces, was a strategist who understood the symbolic value of attacking Fort Sumter. On the Union side, Major Robert Anderson found himself in a desperate position. With scant supplies and pressure from Lincoln's administration not to yield, Anderson was caught in a deadly dilemma: surrender or fight. At this point, the fate of millions hung by a thread. As the dawn of the 12th of April approached, the atmosphere in Charleston was tense. The inhabitants had gathered to witness what they considered an act of justice. At 4:30 in the morning, the first explosion resonated, a sound that would become the symbol of the beginning of the Civil War. The Confederate forces began to bombard the fort, launching projectiles that fell like rain of fire. The repercussions of the shots echoed as smoke filled the horizon. As the shots continued, Anderson and his men responded bravely, although their efforts were in vain. After 34 hours of intense bombardment, Major Anderson was forced to surrender. With his capitulation, Fort Sumter became a symbol not only of resistance but also of the fragility of the Union. The war that many had hoped to avoid was now imminent. The immediate consequences of the bombardment were profound. In the North, the attack united public opinion around the cause of the Union. Lincoln, astute, seized the opportunity to call for 75,000 volunteers, initiating the mobilization of troops. But in the South, the victory at Fort Sumter consolidated Confederate morale. It was a triumph that reinforced the idea that the struggle for independence was justified. However, despite the clarity of events, a question emerges in the narrative. There is debate over whether the attack on Fort Sumter was a deliberate act of aggression or an inevitable response to Lincoln's provocation. It is examined whether it would have been possible to avoid the conflict through negotiation or if the nation's fate was sealed. These questions leave a haunting trail in history, a reminder that decisions in critical moments can have indelible repercussions. As the war loomed over the nation, the next chapter was preparing to unfold. Lincoln's response would mark a turning point, transforming a local confrontation into a national war. It is pertinent to analyze how the president would respond and what sacrifices would be demanded to preserve the integrity of the Union. The response would shape the future as the echo of the cannons of Fort Sumter resonated in the heart of a nation at war. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. The attack on Fort Sumter unleashed a powerful response. The repercussions of the cannon fire marked the beginning of a conflict that would not only change the fate of the nation but also reveal the tenacity of the Union government. In the days that followed, President Abraham Lincoln faced a dilemma: how to respond to the insurrection of the southern states without provoking further bloodshed. In the context of this issue, the political and social atmosphere was a mix of anxiety and determination. Citizens of the North, many of whom were unaware of the realities of war, began to perceive the reality of an imminent conflict. The news of the attack had ignited a patriotic fervor, but it had also generated uncertainty. There was debate over whether the Union could remain united in the face of the Confederate threat. Tensions were palpable and time was running short. Lincoln, a leader who had risen to the presidency amid divisions, understood that the situation demanded a decisive response. In his mind, the preservation of the Union was essential not only for the stability of the country, but for the future of democracy. On the 15th of April in the year 1861, one day after the fall of Fort Sumter, Lincoln issued a proclamation that would resonate throughout history. He called for 75,000 volunteers to serve in the armed forces. This act was not merely a mobilization. It was a declaration of principles, a manifestation of resistance. Among the key figures was the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, who would play a fundamental role in the organization. Cameron, an experienced politician, dedicated himself to mobilizing resources, while other leaders, such as General Winfield Scott, began to devise strategies to confront an enemy that, although initially perceived as disorganized, had shown cohesion. The development of events accelerated. Northern cities from New York to Chicago filled with recruits. Recruitment offices were crowded, and men departed with fervor, many without understanding the magnitude of the conflict. Meanwhile, women organized to support the soldiers, creating aid societies. The nation seemed to unite around a common purpose, an influence that resonated among all. But Lincoln's response was not solely military. In his proclamation, he had emphasized the need to preserve not only territorial integrity, but also the ideals of freedom. However, amid this fervor, dissenting voices emerged. Some questioned the necessity of war, suggesting peaceful solutions. There was debate over whether there was a path to reconciliation without violence. The consequences of Lincoln's call were immediate. In the South, the mobilization of the North was interpreted as confirmation that war was inevitable. The states that had not yet seceded saw loyalty to the Confederacy grow. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina joined the Confederate effort. The war was expanding, and each new state complicated the situation. The question that remained after the mobilization was not only how the war would be conducted, it also resided in the nature of the conflict. There was analysis over whether this would be a confrontation that would define the nation or simply a dark chapter. The answers were yet to come. Against the backdrop of these tensions, the next chapter was preparing to unfold on the battlefield. The first battles would soon erupt in places like Bull Run, where the ferocity of war would be revealed. It is pertinent to analyze what secrets awaited as men prepared to face each other in a struggle that would change the course of history. The mobilization of the Union transformed into a torrent of conflict on the battlefields. The tensions that had accumulated since Lincoln's election would lead to the first skirmishes that would define the character of the Civil War. In the summer of 1861, hopes for a swift resolution would fade, leaving both sides locked in a brutal struggle. The political and social atmosphere during this period was a breeding ground for confrontation. While the North prepared with confidence, the South, enchanted by its idea of a fight for freedom, felt equally ready. The image of a glorious conflict would turn into a nightmare. The expectations of a brief confrontation would dissipate with the first bullets. The figures that emerged in this phase would be fundamental. The Union General, Irvin McDowell, was at the head of an army that, although inexperienced, had numerical superiority. McDowell had been tasked with leading his troops in the first major battle, the Battle of Bull Run, which would take place on the 21st of July in 1861 in Manassas, Virginia. On the other hand, the Confederate General Pierre G.T. Beauregard, who had defended Fort Sumter, was preparing to face the Unionists with determination. As the troops mobilized, the air was thick with anxiety. The inexperience of the soldiers would become evident in the chaos that would soon unfold. In a scene resembling a theater, thousands of civilians, including politicians, gathered around Bull Run, hoping to witness a swift victory. But war, a complex matter, had other plans. On the day of the battle, the sun shone, and as McDowell's troops advanced, they faced not only the Confederates but also their own expectations. At 10 in the morning, the first shot rang out, marking the beginning of a confrontation that would quickly turn chaotic. The artillery roared, and screams mingled with the sound of bullets. The battle became a torrent of confusion where bravery and fear coexisted. Despite initial efforts, the advance of the Northern troops was halted by fierce Confederate resistance. Beauregard, with the help of General Joseph E. Johnston, managed to execute a strategic maneuver that would change the course of the battle. The arrival of reinforcements from the Confederate Army was the turning point. The Confederate soldiers, motivated by the defense of their land, began to push back the Union forces. The confrontation culminated in a disorderly retreat of the Union troops, who scattered, leaving behind weaponry and the illusion of a swift victory. The Battle of Bull Run was not only a setback for the North, but also a psychological blow that solidified the South's confidence. The struggle had demonstrated that the war would be longer than both sides had anticipated. It is debated whether it was a sign of weakness in the North or a reminder that destiny is forged in uncertainty. The immediate impact of this first major battle was felt across the country. The news of the Union's defeat spread, fueling distrust. The idea that the conflict could be resolved quickly crumbled, leaving Lincoln's administration facing a dilemma: how to mobilize the nation for a war that loomed as endless. The repercussions of Bull Run would resonate in future decisions. The question left by this battle was profound. Distrust in the capability of the Union Army spread, sowing the seeds of change. It is debated how such a large army could be defeated by theoretically inferior forces. The question arose in circles of power, and thus the need for more experienced leaders emerged. Meanwhile, in Manassas, the Confederate triumph had solidified Beauregard's figure. However, victory also brought challenges. The Confederacy now faced the pressure of maintaining its advantage. The battle had left a legacy of ambition, but also of uncertainty. The story of the early battles of Bull Run and Manassas reflects the complexity of war. The repercussions of these confrontations would resonate throughout the conflict, blurring the lines between heroes and villains. And so the question persists: what secrets awaited in the struggle for the Union? As the war dragged on, attention would focus on emerging figures such as Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, who would begin to forge their destinies. History would move toward new chapters, where the art of war would transform and the decisions of its leaders would shape the future of a torn nation. With the aftermath of the early battles, the conflict was far from over. The first battles transformed into a battlefield where strategies and leaders would confront each other. In the decade of the mid-1800s, the American Civil War became inevitable as the repercussions of the separation resonated. Military leaders from both sides began to outline plans that would not only inflict suffering but also define the nation's destiny. In this context, two figures emerge who, through their decisions, would leave an indelible mark: Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. The political atmosphere preceding the war was steeped in tensions. The Union, with its industrialized economy, faced an agricultural South dependent on the slave system. Fears of radical change fueled distrust. In this context, military leaders became key players. Grant, a Union general, had experienced disdain, but his determination led him to rise. On the other hand, Lee, a Southern aristocrat and brilliant strategist, had served in the United States Army. His decision to join the Confederacy, despite his loyalty to the Union, revealed the complexity of loyalties. It is pertinent to analyze the secrets hidden in Lee's choice and the implications it would have. The decisions of these men, marked by ambition and patriotism, were imbued with a sense of destiny. Grant, upon taking command of the Union forces, adopted an offensive strategy. His approach focused on total war, a tactic aimed at dismantling not only enemy forces but also the infrastructure of the Confederacy. In contrast, Lee, at the head of the Army of Northern Virginia, used his knowledge of the terrain and his charisma to inspire his troops. His approach was based on defense and mobility. Events began to unfold rapidly. The first major confrontation at Bull Run in July of 1861 made it clear that the war would not be a stroll. Both sides faced each other with a ferocity that surprised many. The Union's defeat, far from intimidating Grant, propelled him to rethink his strategies. It is pertinent to analyze how the Union could underestimate the determination of the South. The answer lay in a lack of preparation and underestimating military skills. As the war intensified, the decisions of Grant and Lee became critical. Grant decided to concentrate his efforts on controlling the rivers, recognizing that victory would not only be won on the battlefield but also in the economy. The victory at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February of 1862 marked a significant turning point. Grant earned the nickname the Butcher for his relentless approach, which, although effective, raised the moral question of war. The debate continues on how far he would be willing to go. Meanwhile, Lee, with his tactical cunning, achieved a series of victories, including the 7 Days Battle in June and July of 1862. By using surprise, Lee managed to force Union troops to retreat from Richmond. His ability to inspire his men gave him an advantage. However, the cost was high, and the human sacrifice raised questions. The debate continues on whether victory at any price was a triumph. The immediate consequences were palpable. Morale in the North began to waver, while the Confederacy, despite its successes, faced challenges. Grant, realizing that the war could not be won solely on the battlefield, began to integrate broader strategies, seeking to cut supply lines. The Battle of Shiloh, although costly, solidified Grant's reputation. However, the lingering question was the nature of military leadership. The debate continues on what made a leader truly effective, whether tactical skill, charisma, or the ability to make difficult decisions. As the war dragged on, the answer became more complex. As the tensions of war stretched on, the repercussions of Grant and Lee's decisions resonated. The conflict was not only shaping the destiny of a nation, but also served as a mirror of the internal struggles of its leaders. the sacrifices of thousands began to be more than mere statistics. As the chapter of strategies closed, a new stage loomed. The struggle would shift to the west, where control of the Mississippi River would become a primary objective. The decisions made would have repercussions that extended beyond the battlefields. It is pertinent to analyze what secrets awaited in this war and how they would transform the course of history. The strategies of the leaders extended westward, where the struggle for control of the territory was beginning to take shape. The American Civil War was not limited to the East. The vast West became a crucial stage. The ambition to control the Mississippi River, the vital artery of commerce and mobility, transformed the war into a matter of strategies and decisions that would define the future. In this context, the political and social atmosphere was charged with tensions. As the conflict intensified, the West presented itself as a region rich in opportunities but also plagued by challenges. The southern states sought to expand their influence, promoting slavery. Meanwhile, those in the North, determined to preserve the Union, were preparing for a confrontation. The battle for control of the Mississippi would become a focal point, a symbol of power. Among the key players was Ulysses S. Grant, a Union general whose determination would be fundamental. Grant, who had proven his worth, was determined to apply a combination of aggression and tactics. In turn, the Confederacy had leaders like Albert Sidney Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard, who, although facing logistical challenges, sought to maintain control. The development of events at this stage began with the Battle of Shiloh, fought in April of 1862. This confrontation in Tennessee marked a dramatic turning point. The Confederate forces, under the command of Johnston and Beauregard, launched a surprise attack against Grant's troops. The brutality of the battle shocked both sides, with a number of casualties that left the nation stunned. More than 23,000 men were killed or wounded in 2 days, a manifestation of the ferocity that would characterize the conflict. However, the Confederate victory was short-lived. Grant, despite the losses, managed to regroup his troops and counterattack, forcing the Confederates to retreat. This battle not only demonstrated Grant's tenacity, but also revealed the resilience of the Union, marking the first of many victories that would help turn the tide. The next milestone was the Battle of Vicksburg, which lasted from May to July of 1863. Vicksburg, situated on a hill, was a strategic fortress for the Confederacy. The city not only controlled river traffic but also symbolized Confederate power. The capture of Vicksburg became an obsession for Grant. The Siege of Vicksburg was a testament to Grant's cunning. Aware that time was not on his side, he applied siege tactics that isolated the city. The Confederates, led by John C. Pemberton, found themselves trapped. The siege became a war of attrition, where the repercussions of the struggle resonated not only on the battlefield, but also in the minds of those trapped. Finally, on the 4th of July in 1863, Pemberton was forced to surrender. This event not only signified a triumph for Grant, but also altered the balance. With control of the Mississippi, the Union managed to divide the Confederacy, weakening its capacity. The surrender of Vicksburg and the victory at Gettysburg, which occurred almost simultaneously, became a turning point. However, amid these victories, one question remained. It is debated how Grant, a man with failures in his career, could transform into the decisive leader. It is pertinent to analyze what secrets and strategies guided his decisions. As the war progressed, Grant's figure solidified as one of the most notable. The immediate consequences were profound. The victory in the West not only led to the capture of territory, but also laid the groundwork for a new phase. Morale in the North rose, and Grant's image as an effective leader began to resonate. Meanwhile, in the South, the loss of Vicksburg struck the spirit. Ultimately, the war in the West was not just a territorial conflict, it was a struggle for identity. The quest for control of the Mississippi left a legacy that would resonate. But despite the triumphs, the question persisted. It is pertinent to analyze what mysteries awaited and what secrets would be revealed. As the repercussions of the battles in the West began to fade, attention turned to an event that would mark a change. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The next stage was just around the corner. The war in the West reached a decisive point. In a climate of uncertainty, the Civil War had revealed not only territorial differences, but also a profound moral conflict. Slavery, a topic of debate for decades, became the epicenter of the conflict, a question awaiting resolution in the halls of power. In the year 1862, as bullets echoed and the repercussions of war resonated, Abraham Lincoln, President of the Union, found himself at a historical crossroads. The situation was critical. Confederate troops had achieved several victories, and Northern morale was at a low point. However, amid adversity, an opportunity emerged that would change the course of the war. The social and political context surrounding the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation was complex. Lincoln's administration faced not only military challenges but also pressures from a divided society. In the North, abolitionists clamored for freedom, while many others, fearful of job competition, were reluctant. In the South, slavery was viewed as a pillar of the economy and culture. This polarization created a tense atmosphere. Lincoln, aware of this reality, became a key figure. Since his arrival at the White House, he had expressed his opposition to the expansion of slavery, although his initial actions had focused on preserving the Union. However, as the war progressed, the need to redefine objectives became evident. Victory would be insufficient if it was not accompanied by fundamental change. On the 22nd of September in 1862, after the Battle of Antietam, a costly event in human terms and a tactical victory for the Union, Lincoln finally felt prepared. In a series of letters and speeches, he began to outline his emancipation plan, an act that would not only free slaves in the rebellious states but also position the Union as a defender of freedom. It is debated whether it was an act of altruism or a deeper political strategy. On the 1st of January in 1863, Lincoln delivered the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that would resonate throughout history. In it, he declared that all slaves in states in rebellion would be free, transforming the war into a conflict for freedom. This act, however, was not received with unanimity. In the North, some celebrated, while others viewed it as a provocation. In the South, the reaction was predictable. The proclamation was dismissed. The Emancipation Proclamation had immediate and far-reaching consequences. Following its issuance, thousands of slaves began to flee toward Union lines. This exodus not only strengthened Union forces with new recruits, but also sent a powerful message. The struggle was not only for the preservation of the Union, but for the abolition of slavery. Emancipation resonated among those who had been oppressed. However, the question left by the proclamation was profound. It is debated whether emancipation could resolve the racial and social tensions that had plagued the country, or if it was merely a first step on a path filled with obstacles. As the war continued, the answers would become evident, revealing the complexity of the struggle. As the conflict intensified, the fate of the nation hung by a thread. The proclamation had not only redefined objectives, but had also ignited a flame of hope. However, the true challenge lay ahead. The Battle of Gettysburg, the bloodiest, loomed, a turning point that could decide the future. War loomed on the horizon, and with it, the fundamental question. Would the proclamation be sufficient to secure freedom, or would it become a distant manifestation in a nation in conflict? The Emancipation Proclamation led to a confrontation that would change the course of the Civil War. In the summer of 1863, a palpable uncertainty resonated in the air as the Confederate troops, led by General Robert E. Lee, advanced in their invasion of the North. The Battle of Gettysburg, which would be fought from the 1st to the 3rd of July, would stand as the stage for one of the bloodiest and most decisive confrontations. The war loomed over the small town of Pennsylvania, where thousands of men would prepare to face not only their enemy but also their own fate. The historical context that preceded the battle was a breeding ground of tensions. The Confederate victory at Chancellorsville had granted Lee remarkable confidence. His undefeated army felt invulnerable. On the other side, the Union Army, under the command of General George G. Meade, was in a precarious situation, recovering from several defeats. Lee's decision to take the war to the north aimed not only to seek supplies but also to demoralize the Union population. However, the repercussions of victory also brought the foreboding of devastation. As the forces mobilized, key figures emerged. Robert E. Lee, a brilliant strategist, made bold decisions. His choice to divide his forces and send Stonewall Jackson to execute a flanking maneuver, although successful in the past, would become a dilemma that affected the outcome. On the other hand, George Meade, who had taken command of the Army of the Potomac just a few days earlier, faced the pressure of containing the Confederate push. He was determined not to repeat the mistakes of his predecessors. The battle began with a chance encounter on the morning of the 1st of July, when Confederate troops clashed with Union elements in Gettysburg. The first shots rang out like an omen, and the small town transformed into a chaotic battlefield. As the days progressed, the sound of artillery and the cries of the wounded merged. The fighting intensified, with both sides suffering devastating losses. But the climactic day arrived on the 3rd of July when Lee launched a frontal assault known as Pickett's Charge, a desperate attack that would result in one of the greatest bloodbaths of the war. The immediate consequences were profound. More than 50,000 men fell, dead or wounded, a human cost that left indelible scars. The Union victory not only halted the Confederate advance but also provided a crucial boost to morale. However, the battle left a troubling question. It is debated whether the victory at Gettysburg was truly a decisive turning point or merely a temporary respite in a conflict that still stretched on. As the Union troops celebrated, the repercussions of the battle resonated in the minds of the survivors. The legacy of Gettysburg would become a symbol of resilience and sacrifice, but it also raised questions about the cost of war. On the horizon, the next stage of the conflict was preparing to unleash its own storm. The Siege of Vicksburg, which would begin shortly thereafter, promised to be another crucial chapter in this war that had exceeded all expectations. The Battle of Gettysburg transformed into a siege that would define the course of the Civil War. In the hot spring of 1863, the Mississippi River stood as the heart of a divided nation. Controlling this vital tributary not only meant ensuring transportation, but also segregating the Confederacy, stripping it of its capacity to sustain a war. The repercussions of the cannons would soon resonate in Vicksburg, a strategic fortress that had become the symbol of Southern resistance. Vicksburg, situated on a hill overlooking the Mississippi, was known as an unbreakable city. Its population, composed of soldiers and civilians, prepared for what seemed to be an inevitable siege. Beneath the surface, the political and social tension became palpable. The Confederacy, led by Jefferson Davis, had wagered everything on this city, aware that its fall would mean a devastating blow. Davis's leadership, though vigorous, faced increasing pressure. It is pertinent to analyze whether the Confederates could maintain their territorial integrity. The Union commander, General Ulysses S. Grant, had been formulating a plan. After the victory in Chattanooga, his reputation had solidified, and his troops, hardened in battle, were ready for the challenge. Grant knew that controlling the city would mean a decisive step toward victory. In the tense silence that precedes the storm, his strategy loomed over the Confederates. In May of 1863, the siege closed in. Grant's forces, numbering nearly 77,000 men, began to surround the city with trenches and fortifications. Grant's strategy was clear: suffocate Vicksburg, cut its supply lines, and force a surrender. The Confederates, led by John C. Pemberton, found themselves at a crossroads. With their 33,000 soldiers entrenched, Pemberton faced a dilemma: resist to the last man or surrender. Days turned into weeks. The siege became a war of attrition. As the cannons roared, the food supply within Vicksburg began to dwindle. The civilian population, caught in the midst of the conflict, began to suffer. Conditions became unbearable and desperation set in. It is debated whether a fortress could truly withstand such adversity. On July 4th of 1863, a day that would resonate in history, Pemberton was forced to make a heart-wrenching decision. After weeks of bombardment and critical shortages, the surrender of Vicksburg became imminent, in an act that symbolized not only the surrender of a city, but also the fracture of the Confederate dream. Pemberton handed his sword to Grant. The Union had achieved not only victory but also control of the Mississippi, dividing the Confederacy. The consequences of this event were profound. The fall of Vicksburg marked a turning point. Southern morale crumbled, while the North celebrated a victory that would solidify its determination. Grant, now a hero, emerged as the general who could lead the Union to victory. However, the human cost was enormous. Tens of thousands suffered, and the city was left scarred. It is pertinent to analyze what secrets lay hidden in the ruins of Vicksburg and how they would affect history. The analysis of the Siege of Vicksburg is not limited to mere military victory. It raises the question of how a city filled with aspirations became a battlefield that would decide the fate of a nation. The past intertwines with the present, leaving a legacy that would endure. The impact of the victory resonated in the Union's strategy and marked the path toward total war. As Vicksburg surrendered, the South prepared to face another onslaught. With the fall of this city, the conflict would become even more brutal, and General Sherman would begin his devastating campaign. Total war was not merely a strategy, but a manifestation of the desperation emerging from a heartbreaking conflict. History, as always, awaited the next question yet to be unveiled. The Siege of Vicksburg gave way to a series of devastating offensives that would change the course of the Civil War. On the horizon, the figure of William Tecumseh Sherman began to take shape, a man whose brutal approach to warfare would mark a turning point. The tactic of total war, which he would embody, aimed not only to defeat the Confederate forces, but also to dismantle their capacity to sustain themselves. The year 1864 found the Confederacy on the brink of the abyss. Resources were scarce and morale was fading. In the North, the administration of Abraham Lincoln, although determined, faced criticism. In this context, Sherman, a scholar of the art of war, prepared to execute a plan that would resonate throughout history. Known as Sherman's March, Sherman, a man of complex emotions, had proven his worth in battle. His experience had taught him that the enemy must not only be defeated on the battlefield, but that their resources must be destroyed. With this vision, Sherman began his preparations for the campaign southward, a bold move. On the 15th of November in 1864, Sherman initiated his famous March to the Sea, a journey of more than 300 miles from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. But this would not be a simple march. It would be a methodical devastation, an attempt to break the ties of the Confederacy. During this journey, Sherman's troops not only faced Confederate soldiers, but also became a force of terror for Southern communities. Sherman's decisions were cold and calculated. His directive was clear. Men and women should not be treated violently, but their properties must be destroyed. This strategy of total war sought to strip the enemy of their ability to resist, destroying not only the armed forces but also the economic fabric. Plantations were consumed by flames, railroads essential for supply were dismantled, the repercussions of cannons and the clamor of flames resonated. And with each city that fell, the Confederate hold weakened. In his advance, Sherman encountered a moral dilemma. The destruction of Atlanta, a strategic point, was a devastating blow. In taking the city, Sherman not only secured a stronghold, but also destroyed a symbol of Southern pride. It is debated whether it was a necessary act of war or an act of brutality. In Sherman's mind, war was not won with leniency. As days turned into weeks, the troops continued their march, leaving a desolate landscape. The strategy of total war involved a high human cost, and the immediate consequences were evident. Southern communities faced a crisis, not only due to the loss of life, but also because of the fracture of social cohesion. The men who once fought for the Confederacy found themselves demoralized. Sherman's march culminated in December of 1864 with the capture of Savannah, a vital port. This triumph represented not only a military victory, but also a psychological blow. The Confederacy, on the brink of ruin, found itself at a crossroads. It is debated whether they could recover or if Sherman's march would be the final manifestation of their resistance. Sherman's decisions, although effective, left a contradictory legacy. On one hand, the Confederate forces had been weakened. On the other, the brutality of his campaign ignited a moral debate that would endure. It is pertinent to analyze whether victory at any cost was justifiable. As the war progressed, the question of morality continued to raise inquiries. Thus, Sherman's campaign stood as a testament to the complexity of war, a reflection of difficult decisions. The influence of his actions projected onto history, leaving a trail of uncertainty. As the war approached its climax, Abraham Lincoln faced his own challenges. In the coming weeks, his re-election would ensure the continuity of a leadership that remained steadfast. History was about to take a turn, one that would reveal both the fragility and resilience of a nation at war. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. Sherman's march left a profound mark on the psyche of the nation. The repercussions of the bullets and the cries of the fallen echoed in every corner of the United States. As the conflict entered its fourth year, the political atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The instability would transform into a decisive crossroads for the future of the Union. On the horizon of 1864, the country found itself in a state of uncertainty. The struggle had taken a devastating human toll, and the re-election of Abraham Lincoln, a leader of unwavering determination, became a central issue. His Emancipation Proclamation had altered the dynamics of the war and the perception of his leadership. However, the elections reflected the will of a weary people. It was debated whether Lincoln, the man who had promised to preserve the Union, could win the support of the electorate. The political context was complex. Opposition to Lincoln had grown, fueled by discontent over the prolongation of the conflict. The Democratic National Convention, held in Chicago in August of 1864, became a hotbed of criticism. The Democrats, led by George B. McClellan, a former general, advocated for a ceasefire. McClellan represented a faction yearning for change. This desire for peace contrasted with Lincoln's commitment to continue the fight. In this climate of tension, events began to unfold rapidly. As the election date approached, military victories became a crucial factor. The capture of Atlanta in September by General William Tecumseh Sherman was a significant milestone. This victory not only dealt a blow to Confederate morale, but also revitalized faith in Lincoln's administration. The image of Sherman leading his troops became a symbol of determination. The elections took place on the 8th of November in 1864, in a weary country. Despite the tensions, the people turned out to vote. With notable participation, the result was a clear reflection of the desire to move forward. Lincoln received overwhelming support, obtaining 55% of the popular vote and a crushing victory in the Electoral College. This backing was not only a personal triumph, but also a mandate to continue with his vision. The immediate consequences of Lincoln's re-election were profound. His leadership ensured the continuity of total war policy. The morale of the Union Army was bolstered, and Sherman's plans to advance solidified. However, Lincoln's victory also intensified divisions. Opponents continued to question his strategy, and discontent in the North did not dissipate. The war remained present, and the question persisted as to whether Lincoln's re-election would be sufficient to lead the Union to victory. Thus, the question of the chapter lies in the uncertainty surrounding the future of the nation. Despite Lincoln's electoral victory, the challenge of rebuilding a divided country still lay ahead. It was debated whether Lincoln's leadership at this moment could guarantee lasting peace and unity. History, in its relentless march, would reveal the answers. In the next chapter, the Confederacy would begin to face an inevitable decline, marked by a scarcity of resources and crumbling morale as Union forces advanced. The struggle for the survival of the Confederacy would raise new questions about the fate of a staggering nation. The re-election of Lincoln manifested with all its strength. As the curtain of war fell over the South, the Confederacy, which had once resonated with hope, began to wobble under the weight of resource scarcity and a weakened fighting spirit. The struggle for independence, which had galvanized many, now faced the harsh reality of a prolonged conflict. On the horizon of 1864, the political and social atmosphere in the Confederate States turned grim. Initial victories faded and the inexorable advance of Union forces pressed southward. The scarcity of supplies became palpable. Cities that once vibrated with economic activity began to experience the effects of hunger. Railroads, vital for transportation, were constantly attacked and the infrastructure crumbled. In this context of desolation, key figures of Confederate leadership struggled to maintain cohesion in a weary army. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, found himself trapped in a web of difficult decisions. His firmness was undeniable, but his ability to inspire a people who were beginning to surrender was increasingly questioned. Letters from soldiers filled with complaints arrived at his desk, reminding him of the fragility of the human spirit. Meanwhile, General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, found himself at a strategic crossroads. Although he had proven to be a brilliant leader, the scarcity of men and resources began to erode his capacity. His famous stand at Gettysburg had been a high point, but the cost had been tremendous. The men who once marched with pride were now exhausted, and desertions increased. It is pertinent to analyze whether Lee could still find a way to change the course of the war, or if his military genius would be drowned in despair. The unfolding of events in this chapter is defined by a series of battles and critical decisions. In the winter of 1864, Union troops led by Ulysses S. Grant began launching more aggressive offensives. Grant's strategy of attrition began to bear fruit. In April, at the Battle of the Wilderness, the Confederate Army found itself caught in a fierce struggle. The casualties were devastating, but the already weakened Confederate Army felt the blow even more intensely. Meanwhile, the situation in the South became critical. Cities like Atlanta became centers of resistance, but also symbols of decay. In September of 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman would launch his March to the Sea, a total war tactic aimed at breaking the morale of the civilian population. The Siege of Atlanta, which culminated in its capture, left the Confederacy without one of its industrial centers. Defeat loomed over the South, and citizens wondered what future awaited them. The immediate consequences of these events were deeply felt. Morale, which had once been a stronghold, crumbled. Letters from soldiers, once filled with fervor, now reflected disillusionment. Families began to question the sacrifice. It is pertinent to analyze whether independence was such a noble goal if the cost was destruction. The repercussions of the decisions made by Confederate leaders resonated. Jefferson Davis, in his effort to maintain unity, faced pressure from governors who demanded more resources. However, the reality was that resources were becoming increasingly scarce, fueling frustration. It is pertinent to analyze whether Davis could maintain cohesion. The question surrounding this period of decline is profound. As the Confederacy crumbled, the question persisted. It is pertinent to analyze what might have happened if strategic decisions had been different and if Lee had had more resources. History, written with the blood of thousands, faces a complexity that still resonates. Thus, as the Confederacy wobbled, the gaze of the nation focused on the imminent fall of Richmond, the capital. Defeat loomed over the South, heralding an irreversible transformation. Resistance might be on the brink of collapse, but the conflict still had chapters to write. The Confederate decline manifested itself forcefully in the heart of the Confederacy. The fall of Richmond, the capital of the South, loomed not only as a decisive military event, but also as a symbol of the devastation of the Confederate dream. On the horizon, defeat hovered over the people, while hope faded away. In the final months of 1864, the political and social landscape in the South was desolate. The Confederacy, weakened, stood on the brink of collapse. Hunger ravaged the cities and the soldiers' resolve diminished. The failed strategy of a prolonged war and the siege of key cities had left a deep wound. Meanwhile, in the north, the Union Army, led by Ulysses S. Grant, advanced with determination. The Confederate leaders, with Jefferson Davis at the helm, grappled with difficult decisions. The question was how to sustain a war that no longer had the support of the people. Rumors of an imminent Union offensive spread, and anxiety gripped the population. Morale fell as Northern victories grew stronger. On the 29th of March in 1865, Ulysses S. Grant launched a series of coordinated attacks. On the battlefield, Confederate generals such as Robert E. Lee desperately tried to contain the advance. Lee, known for his cunning, found himself in a complicated position. His supply lines were compromised, and the experience of war faced the reality of total defeat. It was debated whether such a revered leader could be ensnared by the web of his own decisions. On the 2nd of April, the siege closed in. Union forces launched a massive attack on Petersburg, a stronghold protecting Richmond. The battle was fierce, a torrent of artillery and men. As Union soldiers advanced, horror became tangible. The streets of Richmond, which had vibrated with the Confederate cause, now filled with an unsettling silence. Columns of smoke mingled with the heavy air. On the 3rd of April, the fall of the city was realized. Confederate forces retreated, leaving a void that resonated with loss. Richmond, the core of resistance, surrendered. The news of the fall reached Confederate soldiers, sowing desolation. The image of a city in flames became a symbol. It is pertinent to analyze what secrets awaited in this collapse. The immediate consequences were devastating. The morale of Southern troops plummeted, many soldiers deserted. The Confederacy, conceived as a symbol of autonomy, lay exposed, its fragility revealed. The impact of the fall of Richmond resonated beyond. The Confederate capital became a reminder of the divisions that had fractured the nation. The city, now in Union hands, faced the task of reconstruction. It was debated whether it would be possible to restore peace and unity. As Union troops marched, the question of the war intensified. The fall of Richmond not only marked the end of an era, but also left unresolved questions about the future. It is pertinent to analyze how the wounds could be healed. History had taken a turn, but its complexity had only begun to unfold. The transition to the next chapter appeared inevitable. With the fall of Richmond, attention shifted to Appomattox, where the fate of the Confederacy would be sealed in a surrender that would change history. The war still loomed on the horizon, while the final decisions of its leaders resonated. The fall of Richmond not only symbolized defeat, but also left an uncertainty about the future of a torn nation. The forces of the Union, led by Ulysses S. Grant, were on the move, and each step resonated with an imminent end. However, the outcome would not be reduced to a simple military triumph. It was intertwined with the decisions of men whose actions would mark history. The scene had transformed into a field of desolation. In the months prior, the Confederate Army, under the command of General Robert E. Lee, had seen its strength fade. The casualties were devastating and supplies were scarce. The lands that had once been fertile lay in ruins, and the fighting spirit of the soldiers was threatened by anguish. There was a debate about what future awaited a faltering Confederation. In this grim context, the paths of Lee and Grant were destined to cross in a place that would become a symbol of reconciliation. Appomattox Courthouse. In this small town in Virginia, history would take a decisive turn, where bullets would be replaced by surrender. Robert E. Lee, a man of honor and a formidable strategist, had led his troops with courage. But the reality was undeniable. On the 9th of April in 1865, in the home of a farmer, Lee would find himself facing Grant. The latter, a man who had risen from poverty, was now the commanding general of the Union forces. Relentless in his pursuit to restore the nation, it is pertinent to analyze who was the victor and who was the vanquished in this war of ideologies. The moment of surrender was marked by a mix of solemnity and respect. Lee, in his grey uniform, and Grant, dressed more simply, faced each other in a room filled with history. The decisions made by both were significant. Grant, with a vision of reconciliation, offered Lee generous terms, allowing the Confederate soldiers to return home, fostering hope for a future in peace. Lee, with a heavy heart, accepted, aware that his decision would affect not only his men but also the future. The moments leading up to the signing of the agreement were charged with emotions. The words that resonated would be remembered as one of the most significant declarations. The surrender not only marked the end of hostilities, but also sowed the seeds of a new era. However, the question persists about whether the nation could truly heal its wounds. The immediate consequences were both a relief and a challenge. The war had left indelible scars. The news of the surrender spread, generating mixed reactions. While some celebrated, others felt the anguish of an uncertain future. Reconciliation presented itself as a question, a distant promise. It is pertinent to analyze what paths the United States would take in its effort to rebuild an identity. In the repercussions of those decisions lay a greater question: the fate of emancipation and the treatment of the enslaved. The war had freed millions, but it is pertinent to analyze what rights and opportunities would await them. Inequality lurked, and the struggle for civil rights was just beginning. Thus, the chapter of surrender at Appomattox closed, but not without leaving a trail of questions. The story of the Civil War was not limited to battles. It was a tale of intertwined lives, fateful decisions, and an uncertain future. Like footprints, the events of that day would leave a mark on the collective memory. The war had ended, but its legacy would still resonate. As the nation ventured into a new chapter, the assassination of President Lincoln would become a tragic turning point, a reminder that peace was still far away. It is pertinent to analyze what complexities would loom over the new era. History, as always, awaited its revelations. The surrender of the Confederation transformed into an even deeper tragedy. As the American Civil War drew to a close, a hope shone on the horizon. However, the repercussions of the conflict still resonated, and violence had not disappeared. In this context, President Abraham Lincoln, the man who had guided the Union through its darkest hour, became the target of a deadly conspiracy that would mark a turning point in the history of the country. The political and social atmosphere that preceded the assassination was tense. The victory of the Union offered a respite, but it also left a wounded country with deep scars that would require time to heal. The southern states faced an uncertain future, while the North began to glimpse a new era. However, this transformation was not welcomed by all. Resentments persisted, and opposition to Reconstruction became palpable. A climate of vengeance loomed, a breeding ground for discontent. In this landscape, key figures emerged. John Wilkes Booth, a theatre actor and fervent supporter of the Confederate cause, became the face of hatred. Booth, motivated by his conviction that Lincoln was a tyrant, would devise a bold plan. The decision to assassinate the president was not taken lightly. It was the result of a process of radicalization that led him to believe that Lincoln's death could restore honor to the South. On the 14th of April in the year 1865, a night that promised celebration, Ford's Theatre in Washington, D.C. prepared to welcome its illustrious guest. Lincoln, accompanied by his wife Mary Todd, attended the performance of Our American Cousin. However, as the plot unfolded, Booth moved in the shadows. In a twist of fate, Booth accessed the presidential box, an act that would be remembered as one of the most horrendous. The hours that followed the gunshot resonated with a deafening force. Lincoln fell mortally wounded, and the theatre, which had once been a space of entertainment, transformed into a scene of horror. The news of the assassination spread, and the nation, still recovering from the scars of war, plunged into mourning. The life of the president, a man who had dedicated his career to the Union, was extinguished in an instant, leaving his country in shock. The immediate consequences of the assassination were devastating. The nation, which had begun to glimpse the possibility of peaceful reconstruction, faced a grim future. The president's death left a leadership void at a critical moment, and the question of who would take the reins became a mystery. Lincoln's figure transformed into a symbol not only of the struggle for freedom but also of the fragility of peace. It is pertinent to analyze what secrets awaited in this dark chapter. Lincoln's assassination not only left a legacy of pain but also of uncertainty. There is debate over whether Booth was merely a fanatic or a pawn in a broader conspiracy, and who else might have been involved. History, in its complexity, invites us to question accepted narratives. As the nation recovered, a manhunt for Booth was unleashed, who had fled. His capture became an obsession for the authorities. The hunt for Booth sought not only justice but also revealed underlying tensions. As the mystery of the assassination unfolded, broader questions also emerged. Reconstruction, now more urgent, faced a monumental challenge: how to unite a torn nation. Lincoln's figure, even in his absence, would become a hope and a reminder of the need to heal. The assassination of Lincoln not only marked the end of an era, but also left a legacy that would resonate. The influence of his death would project onto political and social decisions, and the repercussions of that day would continue to be felt in the struggles for civil rights. History invites us to reflect on the lessons we can still learn. As the lights dimmed and the search for Booth intensified, the country found itself at a crossroads. Reconstruction, with all its promises, began to take shape. But the repercussions of Lincoln's assassination would resonate as a reminder of how fragile peace could be. The life of one man had been extinguished, but his legacy would continue to guide the nation. With the repercussions of the shot still reverberating, the country prepared to face the challenges of Reconstruction. It is pertinent to analyze whether the nation could find a way to heal the deep divisions. The answer would unfold in the next chapter, where the arduous task of rebuilding the country would begin to take shape. The assassination of Lincoln transformed into one of the most complex stages of American history, Reconstruction. With the war officially over, the country found itself in a state of desolation. The scars were fresh, and the repercussions of the bullets seemed to resonate in every corner. The task of reintegrating the southern states would be a laborious process filled with challenges, a labyrinth of political and economic decisions. Reconstruction was not simply the restoration of peace, it was an attempt to redefine the identity of the United States. In the North, the atmosphere was one of hope, while in the South, defeat and uncertainty loomed. The destruction of cities like Atlanta and the devastation of the agricultural economy left millions wondering how they could rebuild not only their homes but also their way of life. Political leaders, such as President Abraham Lincoln and his successor Andrew Johnson, found themselves at a crossroads. Lincoln had outlined his plan with the 10% rule, which stipulated that a state could reintegrate if 10% of its voters took an oath of loyalty. However, Lincoln's death in 1865 left a void and a shift in direction that would complicate the process. Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat loyal to the Union, assumed the presidency in a context of distrust. Johnson's decisions quickly became a topic of controversy. While many in the North desired a radical approach, Johnson opted for a policy of reconciliation with the former Confederates. His administration allowed Southern states to establish governments that often reinstated old hierarchies, leading to the creation of black codes that kept African Americans in a second-class condition. There is debate over whether reconciliation was the right path or if the lack of a firmer approach sowed the seeds of future conflicts. Meanwhile, in the South, the white population, especially landowners, faced a dilemma. The abolition of slavery had stripped many of their source of labor. The system of sharecropping became an alternative. But in many cases, it perpetuated the exploitation of former slaves trapped in a cycle of debt. Those who had fought for the Confederacy found themselves in a changing world. Resistance to this new reality would give rise to violent movements, including the formation of the Ku Klux Klan in 1866, a group that would become a symbol of terror. The unfolding of events is characterized by a series of tensions. State elections in the South were often marked by violence, and efforts to implement progressive policies faced fierce opposition. The creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, intended to assist former slaves, was seen as a threat by many white Southerners. Racial conflicts intensified, and the dream of peaceful reconciliation seemed increasingly distant. The immediate consequences were profound. The struggle for civil rights for African Americans became a central issue, and constitutional amendments, such as the 13th, 14th, and 15th, were proposed to guarantee their freedom. However, the implementation of these laws faced monumental challenges. The promises of equality were diluted in practice, leaving many with the feeling that the war had not achieved its objectives. The question of Reconstruction lies in its legacy. There is debate over whether it was a failed effort to build a more just nation or an intermediate phase in a cycle of oppression. The answers are not simple, and the repercussions of the decisions made resonate even today. Thus, Reconstruction presents itself as a period of contradictions and frustrated hopes. While some dreamed of a new era, others fought to maintain the status quo. The influence of the war still projected onto the future, and the struggle for national identity became complex. As we move forward, we will delve into the amendments of Reconstruction, which promised to abolish slavery and guarantee rights. However, their implementation would encounter fierce resistance. It is analyzed whether the nation could truly overcome its deepest divisions, or if it would find itself trapped in an endless cycle of conflict. The arduous task of rebuilding the country would soon reveal a new web of challenges. Amidst the torn nation, oppression still loomed over millions of African Americans. The Civil War had ended, but the struggle for civil rights was just beginning. In this context, the Reconstruction Amendments emerged, a set of constitutional reforms that promised to abolish slavery and guarantee fundamental rights. However, these promises were far from simple. They were laden with tensions, conflicts, and a question that would persist. The political and social context of this period was complex. The nation was divided. The victorious North harbored an urgency to transform society. Republican leaders, many of whom had supported abolition, saw in Reconstruction an opportunity to forge a new identity. In contrast, the devastated South fought for its own identity, clinging to its old structures. Reconciliation would not be easy. The key figures in this story include individuals such as President Abraham Lincoln, whose emancipatory legacy extended, and the radicalism of leaders like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, who advocated for a firmer approach. After Lincoln's assassination, his successor, Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat, faced the dilemma of how to integrate the secessionist states without alienating the Northern radicals. Johnson opted for a policy of leniency, which proved controversial and provoked backlash. As the year 1865 progressed, the debate over abolition intensified. On January 1st of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation had declared the freedom of slaves in the states in rebellion, but it was not enough. The constitutional amendment that would abolish slavery was introduced. The path to its approval was fraught with obstacles. Many Southern legislators wondered if the freedom of African Americans would pose a threat, but the pressure from abolitionist movements led Republicans to unite. On January 31st of 1865, Congress approved the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. The repercussions of this vote reverberated, marking a milestone that promised to change history. However, this triumph was not the end. In a country where racism persisted, questions about civil rights took center stage. It is pertinent to analyze what freedom meant without rights and how they would be guaranteed in a South that resisted. The answer came with the approval of the 14th Amendment in 1868, which guaranteed citizenship to all persons born or naturalized, and the 15th Amendment in 1870, which prohibited the denial of the right to vote on account of race. These amendments represented a monumental shift, a promise that the nation was moving away from its oppressive practices. It is debated whether they would be sufficient to ensure equality. However, the immediate consequences of these reforms were contradictory. Despite the approval of the amendments, the experience of African Americans did not improve immediately. The resistance from former slave owners and the emergence of violent groups such as the Ku Klux Klan revealed that the path to equality would be long. The struggle to implement and protect these rights would face fierce opposition. The question of the Reconstruction Amendments lies in their legacy. It is debated whether they were truly effective in their purpose. Despite their approval, the long-term impact was ambiguous, leaving the nation trapped in racial conflicts. The question persists: was Reconstruction a new beginning or a manifestation of old tensions? As the country attempted to understand the implications, Southern resistance began to rise. History was far from over. The next chapter would reveal how opposition to the reforms was organizing in increasingly violent forms. The struggle for civil rights not only continued but intensified. The struggle for civil rights and the reintegration of the Southern states unleashed fierce resistance, a dark force that would spread across the new social landscape. The end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery did not signify the end of oppression. On the contrary, it was the prelude to a resistance that would manifest in extreme and violent forms. As the promises of Reconstruction took shape, the emergence of groups such as the Ku Klux Klan would reveal the deep resentment and opposition to change. In the context of a nation newly emerged from conflict, the South found itself at a crossroads. The abolition of slavery, the enactment of the amendments, and the efforts to reintegrate the Confederate states generated a climate of uncertainty. For many, these changes represented a threat not only to their way of life, but to their identity. The South, which had thrived on agricultural production sustained by slave labor, was forced to redefine its structure. The emancipation of millions of African Americans, instead of being celebrated, was met with a sense of loss. Among the actors that emerged was a group that would become synonymous with terror, the Ku Klux Klan. Founded in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee by Confederate veterans, this group initially presented itself as a secret society to restore the previous social order. However, soon its mission turned into a campaign of terror, with tactics ranging from harassment to the murder of those who defended equality. The figure of the Knight of the Klan with its white attire became a symbol of fear, a manifestation of the old hierarchies. The decision of the Klan leaders to use violence as a political tool to intimidate the newly emancipated and their allies, such as the radical Republicans, revealed a shift in the dynamics of power. The violence was not limited to intimidation. It transformed into an open struggle against any attempt at racial integration. Fear became a weapon, and the South found itself trapped in a cycle of retaliation. The events that followed in the South were a reflection of this conflict. In the year 1868, several states saw an increase in Klan activity, manifesting in attacks on political meetings. This climate of terror reached its peak in the election of 1868, where the attempts of African Americans to exercise their right to vote were met with brutal resistance. The members of the Klan, in their eagerness to destabilize Reconstruction politics, carried out a series of violent attacks. The culmination of this violence was evident in the Colfax Massacre of 1873, where a confrontation between white Republicans and African Americans culminated in an armed attack that left more than 100 African Americans dead. This event revealed the depth of resentment and the determination of resistance groups to maintain their vision. The response of the federal government was insufficient, allowing the Klan and other groups to continue their campaign of terror. It is pertinent to analyze what secrets awaited in the depths of Southern resistance. There is debate over whether this violence was a manifestation of the past or something deeper. The Klan not only represented resistance to Reconstruction, but also a question that spoke to the struggle for power in a transforming country. The legacy of the conflict was not limited to the battlefields. It manifested in the very fabric of society. The immediate consequences were devastating. The systematic violence of the Klan not only succeeded in destabilizing Reconstruction politics, but also sowed deep fear. The federal government's inability to protect citizens left a sense of abandonment. The era of Reconstruction, initially filled with promises, turned into a constant struggle for rights. In the end, Southern resistance, embodied in the terror of the Ku Klux Klan, posed a question that would resonate throughout history. There is debate over whether it was possible for the struggle for freedom to be so overshadowed by hatred and whether the nation could heal its deep wounds. This chapter would not close with the surrender of the Klan, but would transform into a legacy of struggle that would continue. As tensions intensified, attention turned to the politics of Reconstruction. It is pertinent to analyze how federal authorities would confront the resistance of those who refused to accept a new order. The response would become a turning point. Southern resistance transformed into an even deeper issue, one that would mark the history of the United States during the Reconstruction era. With the end of the Civil War, the country faced a dilemma: how to reintegrate the Southern states and rebuild a torn nation. In this context, the politics of Reconstruction became an ideological battleground where tensions between Congress and President Andrew Johnson intensified. As the scars of war began to heal, the political atmosphere was marked by a desire for vengeance and the need for reconciliation. The nation found itself in a state of uncertainty, where the promises of freedom for African Americans clashed with the resistance of a Southern society that refused to accept its new reality. In this crucible of contradictions, the figure of Andrew Johnson emerged as a key player, a president facing the monumental task of guiding the country toward unity. Johnson, a Southerner loyal to the Union, took office with the hope of implementing a rapid reconstruction that would restore order without severely punishing former rebels. However, his vision was problematic. While Congress, dominated by radical Republicans, sought a more punitive approach, Johnson maintained a conciliatory stance that cost him support. The tension between these two powers became a political spectacle, where each decision was a move in a complicated game. In the summer of 1865, Johnson announced his Reconstruction Plan, which included amnesty for many former Confederates and the rapid readmission of the states. This approach, although well-intentioned, was perceived as an attempt to restore the old order, ignoring the injustices that had fueled the war. Congress, alarmed, began to question his leadership. Debates in Congress became intense. The voices of radical Republicans, such as Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, called for a reconstruction that would secure fundamental rights for African Americans. This struggle for the future became a confrontation between two opposing visions. The debate centered on whether it was truly possible to reconcile the past with a future that promised equality. As the year 1866 progressed, tensions sharpened. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to protect the rights of African Americans and counteract the black codes that were emerging in the South. Johnson vetoed the law, which only exacerbated the fracture. For the first time in history, Congress managed to override a presidential veto, an act that set a precedent. Meanwhile, the South began to restructure under the watchful eye of the government. The creation of Reconstruction governments allowed African Americans to participate in political life, albeit with obstacles. The influence of the Ku Klux Klan and other secret organizations began to spread, sowing fear. This era of transformation faced not only resistance but also revealed the fragility of its achievements. The politics of Reconstruction were marked by decisions that would resonate. The 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote without racial discrimination, became milestones. However, beneath it all lingered the question of whether they would be sufficient to change the social fabric of a nation marked by centuries of oppression. As the conflict between Johnson and Congress intensified, the situation became untenable. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act, which divided the Southern states into 5 military districts. This act, driven by the belief that only drastic intervention could ensure peace, was a turning point. The intervention sought not only to protect African Americans but also symbolized the struggle for control of the future. The consequences of these decisions were profound. While some celebrated the progress, others viewed with fear what they considered an oppressive government. Racial and political tensions continued to grow, as the South grappled with the desire to return to a previous order and the need to adapt. The question surrounding this Reconstruction policy lies in its legacy, whether it was a genuine attempt to heal wounds or an effort to maintain white supremacy. The history of Reconstruction is a story of contradictions, where hopes for an egalitarian future clash with the realities of a past that refuses to fade. With the repercussions of the Reconstruction policy resonating, the nation found itself at a crucial juncture. The next chapter will explore how Congress would adopt more drastic measures. The era of radical Reconstruction loomed, promising opportunities and challenges. It is pertinent to analyze what secrets still awaited. The policy of Reconstruction intensified as the repercussions of the Civil War still resonated. At the heart of this conflict, a torn country sought its identity. The era of radical Reconstruction emerged as a period of promises and challenges, where Congress, in an attempt to guarantee the rights of African Americans, set out to impose stricter measures. The historical context of this period is fundamental. By the end of the decade of the 1860s, following the surrender of the Confederacy, the country found itself in a state of confusion. The abolition of slavery had been formalized by the 13th Amendment, but liberation did not mean the end of suffering. In the South, the former Confederate states emerged with a desire to restore their way of life, seeking ways to undermine the achievements of the newly freed. Southern resistance, embodied in violent movements such as the Ku Klux Klan, rose as a threat. In this context, key figures emerged. Among them was Thaddeus Stevens, a congressman from Pennsylvania and one of the most fervent leaders of the radical wing of the Republican Party. Stevens, along with others like Charles Sumner, advocated for a policy that not only restored the Union but also guaranteed equality. His radical vision opposed the more moderate approach of Andrew Johnson, who believed that reintegration should occur without too many restrictions. The tension between these two approaches became a central point. The decision to impose stricter measures resulted in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, aimed at assisting former slaves. However, as Congress took steps, opposition from the South intensified. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 marked a turning point. This act divided the southern states into 5 military districts under federal control and required new constitutions that guaranteed the right to vote for African American men. This act marked the beginning of an era of federal intervention that, while necessary, also sparked resentment. The development of these events was marked by a climate of uncertainty. The elections of 1868 brought Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of the war, to the presidency. Grant, supported by the African American vote, committed to protecting civil rights but faced fierce resistance. Tensions escalated as African Americans began to hold political office for the first time, a situation that generated great uproar. The presence of leaders such as Hiram Revels, the first African-American senator, and Blanche K. Bruce, the first African-American to serve a full term in the Senate, represented a threat to the old order. The immediate consequences of radical Reconstruction were profound. The political participation of African Americans, although fleeting, led to the creation of a new class of leaders. However, the backlash from racist groups and the lack of federal support caused a setback. The promises of Reconstruction began to fade, leaving many African Americans in vulnerability. The question of this era lies in the lingering question: could a lasting change have been consolidated, or was it destined to be a brief flash of hope? Oppression was still present, and the decisions made left a legacy that would transform the nation. As tensions increased, the future of Reconstruction became uncertain. It is pertinent to analyze whether the federal government could maintain its commitment to rights or if it would succumb to pressure. The focus turned to the end of Reconstruction, where the decisions of leaders and Southern resistance intertwined. The next chapter will delve into the end of Reconstruction, exploring how the withdrawal of federal troops would seal a fate of inequality, a persistent repercussion of the struggle for justice. The radical era had begun to dissipate, but the repercussions of its thunder still resonated in the South. Reconstruction, that ambitious promise of rebirth, was in its final gasps. In a context where hopes for a more equitable future were fading, the withdrawal of federal troops marked an ominous turning point. It is pertinent to analyze what legacy those years of struggle for civil rights would leave in a fractured country. In this chapter, we will explore the end of Reconstruction and the aftermath that extended beyond. As the 19th century drew to a close, the political atmosphere in the United States was unsettling. The South, which had suffered the devastation of war, faced a new challenge: the reintegration of its society within a framework of equality. Meanwhile, the North, although victorious, found itself divided between those who wished to continue the change and those who longed to return to pre-war normalcy. The promise of emancipation intertwined with the resistance of former powers. Thus, the landscape became a complex issue where hopes mingled with the threat of segregation. In this context, figures such as President Ulysses S. Grant and Senator Charles Sumner made crucial decisions. Grant, a victorious general, now faced the task of maintaining peace. Despite his desire to protect the rights of African Americans, his administration was undermined by scandals and growing unpopularity. For his part, Sumner, a fervent advocate for equality, called for more decisive intervention to ensure that emancipation did not become an illusion. The outcome of Reconstruction began to take shape in 1876. When the presidential elections became a battleground not only for the White House but for the future of the South, the Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes and his Democratic opponent Samuel J. Tilden found themselves in a contest so close that the results were a matter of controversy. In an agreement known as the Compromise of 1877, it was decided that Hayes would assume the presidency in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. An agreement that sealed the fate of millions. The withdrawal of federal troops was an act laden with symbolism. On one hand, it was understood as a step toward reconciliation. On the other, it was an abandonment. A retreat that would resonate as the final note of a song that promised freedom. Without the protection of federal forces, African Americans in the South found themselves exposed to violence. Groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, which had emerged during Reconstruction, intensified their attacks, sowing fear and restoring a social order based on oppression. The consequences of this withdrawal were immediate and devastating. Southern states quickly began to implement Jim Crow laws, which institutionalized racial segregation and denied fundamental rights to African Americans. The promise of a more equitable society faded, leaving many to wonder how this point had been reached and what unresolved secrets and conflicts had allowed this new era of oppression to arise. The legacy of this stage became a complex issue in American history. Hopes for true equality vanished, and in their place, a system emerged that perpetuated inequality. Instead of a bright future, the South found itself mired in a situation that would project itself for generations. Reconstruction, which had begun with the fervor of freedom, ended as a distant manifestation of what could have been, and so history delves into a labyrinth of decisions and disillusioned hopes. The withdrawal of troops not only marked the end of a chapter, it left a lingering question. It is pertinent to analyze whether the promise of emancipation could have been fulfilled differently, or if it was destined to become an unattainable dream. As the nation faced the aftermath, the question that lingered was what real legacy the Civil War would leave. Against the backdrop of a divided country, the next chapter will explore the profound impact that this war had on American society and how its legacy would endure. The American Civil War, a conflict that tore the nation apart in the 19th century, leaves us with a lasting impact of questions and reflections on its legacy. As we close this chapter, it is essential to look back at the tumultuous journey that brought the United States to a turning point. The end of the war did not mark the closure of a conflict, but rather the beginning of a question that would resonate in the minds of generations to come. In the historical context that followed the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox, the country found itself in a state of radical transformation. The scars of the war were not mere marks, but deep wounds that required attention. The Emancipation Proclamation had freed millions of African Americans. But the reality of their new freedom was steeped in uncertainty. The political atmosphere was charged with tensions as a devastated South struggled to find its identity in a world where slavery was no longer accepted. The debate centered on how to rebuild a torn nation and what place those who had been considered property would occupy. In this context, figures such as Abraham Lincoln, assassinated just days after the surrender, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, became the architects of a new country. Johnson, a Southerner loyal to the Union, faced the monumental challenge of reintegrating the rebellious states. His decisions, often controversial, revealed the complexity of politics. The question arose whether his conciliatory approach was sufficient to heal the wounds or if it left the door open to future divisions. Key decisions of the Reconstruction era were made in an environment of struggle. While Congress pushed measures to ensure civil rights, the South resisted. The formation of groups such as the Ku Klux Klan evidenced the fierce opposition to change. The question of how to achieve true equality in a society rooted in white supremacy became a central theme. The debate continued on whether a divided nation could find the necessary cohesion. The unfolding of these events was a kaleidoscope of achievements and setbacks. The passage of constitutional amendments was a bold step. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th granted citizenship, and the 15th guaranteed the right to vote. However, in the South, resistance manifested in Jim Crow laws, which institutionalized segregation. As federal troops withdrew, inequality loomed over the nation. The question arose whether this was the inevitable fate of a country that had fought for its unity. The immediate consequences were profound. The Southern economy lay in ruins, and the African American population faced an uncertain future. At the same time, the North embarked on its own process of industrialization. However, the legacy of the war extended beyond. It infiltrated the collective psyche. The idea of a united America became an ideal in conflict with reality. The debate continued on whether reconciliation could be achieved or if the wounds of the war would continue to bleed. The analysis of the legacy of the Civil War manifests in the ongoing struggle for civil rights. As the country moved toward the 20th century, the promises of equality continued to be challenged by racism. The fight for civil rights in the 1960s resonated with the same urgency. It is pertinent to analyze whether the repercussions of the past struggle were a symbol of hope or an influence that refused to fade away. Finally, in reflecting on the legacy of the Civil War, it is crucial to consider what we have learned. The war was not only a struggle for union, but also a conflict over what it meant to be American. The quest for freedom has been a journey fraught with obstacles, but also with progress. Each generation has had the responsibility to confront the legacy of that war. At this moment of closure, we face a fundamental question: how will we remember the Civil War and its legacy? As a chapter that taught us about division, or as a lesson on resilience and the ongoing pursuit of true union? The answer may lie in how we choose to confront the challenges of the present. Thus, the legacy of the Civil War becomes a mirror, inviting us to contemplate not only what we have been, but also what we can become. At the crossroads of history, the influence of the war resonates, reminding us that every decision, every lost life, has left an indelible mark. In this journey, it is essential to remember that, although the complexities of the past may be long, there is always room for hope. History, after all, never stops. It continues, waiting for us, its heirs, to write it with courage.